I believe that I had a true experience with a haunting. I used to live in apartment 205 in Kingswood Apartment in Fresno, California. A lot of weird stuff used to happen there while my family and I lived there. I'm a homog. My religion is not Christianity, although I do not doubt that there is a God. I do believe in Jesus Christ, but I was simply not raised that way. My family on both my father and my mother's sides are shaman. Many do not believe our customs and ways to be valid, but you'd be surprised by how much sense it makes to us. I grew up around shaman all my life, listening to chants and stuff. It's awesome. Well, enough talk. Here's my story. When I was a little girl growing up in California and being in a homog family, I grew up with spirits and ghosts and hauntings all around me. I accept it, for it is real to me, although I've never experienced an actual haunting myself. Being around my family of shaman focused me to acknowledge the supernatural. But when I was 9, I did have an experiment on my own. Our apartment has always been rumored to be haunted. As a child, I never really paid too much attention to it. Weird things happen at night. Things go bump in the night. Dishes rattle, and doors slam. I woke up every night from a nightmare I couldn't remember and crawled into bed with my parents. My sisters complain about seeing dark shadows moving across your walls. In our culture, hauntings happen because it is caused by some or something that is associated with the family or someone in the family. In our case, it was my mother. I remember one time, my mother was cleaning the tub, and I was standing out in the hallway watching her. All of a sudden, the door slammed and the lights went out. I heard the lock on the door click in place, and my mother screamed. I stood frozen in my spot, unable to comprehend what I just saw. I banged against the door, and then it opened. The lights were back on, and my mom was still in the tub. Naturally, she accused me of doing it. To this day, I still don't know what had happened. There was a time that something happened to me, not long afterwards, that scared me so bad I forgot about it until a couple of years ago. I remember it being around noon, and I was off on summer vacation. I just finished the 3rd grade. I was laying on my mother's bed reading a book, given me by a former teacher. I started to have this funny feeling all over my body, more like an awareness that something was watching me or something was near me. All of a sudden, the bed started to shake. I felt something, hands maybe, holding me down on the bed, and I was unable to move or even say anything, not even a scream. The bed literally shook for a few seconds. It was over in a matter of minutes, but it scared me terribly. I jumped off the bed and ran into the living room. To this day, I've never told my family or hardly anyone. Those that I've told thought I was joking. Was I? Yet the memory is so vivid, and I remember that feeling of helplessness and fright. It was weird. I sort of forced myself to forget about it until a couple years later, when my class was asked to write about an actual haunting that we know about. I don't know, but things are weird. My shaman grandfathers, both maternal and paternal, came to our house to bless our room. They performed their ritual in our room, on my mother's bed. I remember something about someone dying or committing suicide in our closet, but it was so long ago, I can't remember much about it. My mom has been having dreams about a little girl carrying a knife, chasing her through a rice field in Thailand. My grandfathers did this chant thing, and all this stuff, too much to explain, to capture this thing. They've locked her up in 2 bowls that have sealed and chained together. Part of the chain that was used to seal it was made into an anklet brace that my mother wears around her ankle at all times. The trap used to capture it was something that my grandfathers did. To this day, my mother is doing better, No more Chucky-like girls chasing her. The bowls were taken to my mom's father's altar and locked up. When he passed on, it was given to my mother to keep safe. So now, it's in our bathroom closet on the top shelf. Every time we open the door, there it is. Scary. I get the creepiest feelings when I look at it. So, you wonder, what exactly is going on and what happened? I couldn't tell you, but something did happen, and I've never been able to forget it. Could it be some evil spirit or poltergeist? Who knows? Maybe one day I'll find out eventually. Being a Catholic, I believe there is an afterlife, heaven, etc., and spirits occasionally visit people here on Earth. One winter, my family and I, mom, dad, and 2 younger sisters, went to visit and help out my grandparents, who had recently cleared some land they owned on the Tennessee River, move into their new home. The land they bought had many legends accompanying it, including stories of gold and ghosts. My sisters and I were very interested in exploring the 25 acres of wooded land that had an old Civil War home place on it. An old country store was located about a mile away, and this was the only neighbors my grandparents had. When we arrived, there was a 15-foot long, 15-foot high pile of cut-down trees that had been piled up to make room for the new house. This was a great jungle gym for my sisters and I to play and hide on, being as it was a long way from the house. One day, my mom took my youngest sister on a walk around the woods, while my other sister and I stayed on the wood pile looking into the woods. I saw this black, 4-foot high figure scrambling from tree to tree. At first I thought it was my youngest sister running around, so I called her name. She answered from the opposite direction of the figure that I saw. By that time, I was really frantic, in tears, and running home because I could still see the figure moving extremely fast. It was so fast, I would only see it for about 2 seconds at a time before it went behind another tree. When everyone was in the house, I told them, but my grandpa brushed it off as a bear, even though there aren't any bears in the area. So I felt better. About a week later, after my family and I left, more people were beginning to have experiences, I guess you could say. My grandpa had taken his dog out one night when he had heard a woman's voice faintly yell, "Help me." The dog began to bark, so my grandpa got in his truck and began to circle his property, looking in the ditches for an injured woman. He found no one and went home. About 3 months later, a lady was changing a sign outside the country store around closing time. Extremely scared and shook up, she quit her job because she had seen a quick, black, shadowy figure coming from my grandparents' woods. We still don't know what is living in my grandparents' woods, but other people have seen it, so I know it's not a figure of my imagination. Thanks for reading. One night, about 13 years ago, my brother and I were Christmas caroling with friends around our block. We were about 10 or 11 at the time. After ending the night, my brother and I said goodbye to the last of our friends who had turned in for the night. We were riding doubles on a bike that night, my brother pedaling. We approached the edge of the driveway when he suddenly stopped. We both looked across the street. I said, "Do you see what I see?" He replied, "Yeah." Happening very quickly across the street was a dark shadowy figure, void of prominent features, approximately 7 feet tall. When it began to approach us, we threw the bikes down, and we were able to slide under the electric garage door, still in process of closing. We were able to summon our friend's dad to investigate, but nothing. That night, we rode our fannies home, about 8 houses down. Amazingly, we never mentioned it to our parents, who were waiting in the driveway to take us to the town's candy cane lane. We have since told them about everything, and to this day, when I visit home and happen to walk that corner of the block at night, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder and feel as though I'm being watched. Akenesi East Pine Log Road now houses Riley's Whitby Bull Restaurant. This house was in my wife's family from the late 1960s until it was sold to the present owners, operators of the named restaurant. My family and I moved there in 1993 and lived in the house for 2 years after we moved back here from Atlanta. This house was in my wife's family from the late 1960s until it was sold to the present owners, operators of the named restaurant. My family and I moved there in 1993 and lived in the house for 2 years after we moved back here from Atlanta. This house was built in the late 1800s, estimated from the style, and was remodeled in 1914 when indoor plumbing was installed, and this date appears on the tax records, which would be correct. They used the latest remodeling date for effective date. Archaeologists from SC State Highway Department visited the site in the winter of 1994 when the road in front was being surveyed for widening. I took them under the house, and they showed me where the curve marks in the big supporting beams evidenced that the original part of the house was either built before the war between the states or wood from that era, which was recycled into the house. In any event, the home is an old, large, rambling affair of an old southern home that, like I said, is now a restaurant. It's unusual in that it is the Second Empire style, with a mansard roof and a large wraparound porch with Doric columns. On to the story. We frequently heard footsteps when no one was there, and had strange feelings that we were not alone. I could be in the front room, which I used as an office, and hear someone come down the stairs and stand at the large open pocket doors. When I turned from my computer, no one would be there. I got used to it. One day, I was relaxing in the upstairs bathroom in the old 6-long iron bathtub. It was in the middle of the day. I had some time to relax. My wife was away. The kids were in school. I had no pressing work, so I took a midday soaking bath. I was lying quietly in the hot sudsy water with water up to my neck, stretched out with a washcloth across my face. I heard someone coming down the hall. I slid the washcloth away, opened my eyes, and listened carefully, because I knew I was alone. The footsteps came slowly down the hall, towards the bathroom door, which was at the end of the hall. The footfall stopped at the door, and the old porcelain doorknob moved slightly, like someone had it in their grip, then started to turn slowly in its big square lock housing. It was right near me, because the head of the tub was by the door. I watched over my left shoulder, and then spoke. "Mary Ann?" The turning stopped. I jumped up in a torrent of steamy water and snatched the door open, and there was no one there. No one down the hall. No sounds of anyone running or jumping down the stairs. Just the sounds of dripping bathwater. I grabbed a towel and ran down the hall, down the big hallway stairs, and jumped to the landing. The front door was closed and locked. I could see down the hall to the old Victorian carved door leading out to the back porch. Nothing. I sprinted to the kitchen. Nothing. I looked out into the side drive, in the circular drive out front. No car. Nothing. Doors were locked. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I searched from room to room and found nothing. I never said anything that might spook the family, but nobody likes to be in the house alone anyway. Funny thing is, now that we live in a modern house, built in 1973, across the cotton field from 801 East Pine Log, we still hear noises and footfalls when no one else is in the house. I've sensed a presence more than once, and a teenage friend of a family told us that he saw a kind-looking old man one night, dressed in white, standing in our foyer. It was late at night, and Tyler was in the library, and from where he was sitting, he could see out into the foyer. The man in white looked at him, smiled and nodded, and turning, went down the hall. He said it was really interesting, but not too scary. My grandparents died when I was 4, and we moved into their house. They were the only people who ever lived in it. I ended up getting their room. When I was in 5th grade, I started experiencing things in my room. My TV would go on and off whenever I would think that I need to turn it on or off. I had to sleep with the hall light on. One night, I thought I saw my mom in my room standing by my closet. When I turned my light on, she wasn't there. Then I thought I saw my dad standing in the same spot, but that time I kept looking at him as I went into the hallway to see if he was still sleeping on the couch, and he was. I was looking at him in the living room, in my room, and when I turned my light on, he wasn't there, but still on the couch. It always felt like someone was watching me. Then, my last experience of seeing something was in the same spot, but just ahead looking at me. He looked like he was from the 1700s. When I tried to tell my mom, she wouldn't believe me. I'd wake up at night not being able to breathe, and my sister would run in. Then my mom started to believe me when she'd hear heavy breathing in her room when it was just her in there. I'd be walking, and it would feel like someone was trying to trip me. So I told my mom's mom, and she gave me a cross to hang in my room. When I put it up, I didn't see anything after that, but it always felt like I wasn't alone in my room. Now, years later, I found out that the guy staring at me from the 1700s looked just like a picture in our living room. He was an old relative. When I still go by the house, it still feels like something evil there, but at our new house, it feels like a household. Now that I'm 21, I think that it was my parents' dad still in the room that I had. That's the only reason. A long time ago, about 20 years or so, there was a car crash in front of my driveway. At the time, I did not live there. At that matter, nobody did. In the car, there were 6 young boys, ranging from 6 to 20. They crashed because there were a couple of drunk drivers who hit them head on. All the young men died in the car. About 10 years later, me and my family moved in a double wide on the lot in front of where the men died. About 1 year later, there was an awful car crash at the exact same spot of where the young men died. The woman was not killed, but she was seriously injured. After a couple of years, I went down to get the mail when I heard a strange noise, like a young boy crying. I was the only one at home at the time. I looked around and seen nobody. The crying became fainter and fainter until I could hear no more. The next day, I went back down to check the mail, and I heard talking. 2 men, about 18 years of age. I looked around and saw nobody once again. I listened to the conversation, and I couldn't make out anything they were saying, but I could hear the voices as clear as day. Soon after, the voices began to fade away. I talked to my grandmother, who lives just up the road. She told me that the accident happened about 20 years ago, and everyone in the car were killed. I asked her what time it was that they wrecked. She said it was about 5 to 10 p.m. Around 7 p.m. is when the young woman wrecked her car. A few years after the woman wrecked her car, another woman broke down on the bridge, several feet away from where the young man crashed. Another time, a couple were driving with a full tank of gas when all of a sudden, their gas tank just went empty right where everything was happening. There were several more breakdowns and accidents that happened over the years where the young man crashed, and more of my family members have heard strange talking and crying below our driveway. After time we have moved, and still, there have been breakdowns and accidents at that same location. We think that the bridge and the area around it is haunted by the ghost of the 6 young men. I want to post something that happened to my mother, Marie, my uncle, her brother David, and my aunt, her sister Gail. A little background first, please. Marie was living in Arkansas, David was living in Florida, and Gail was living in South Carolina. Many miles apart, these 3 siblings shared the same dream on the same night and called their mother within 24 hours of the dream to tell her of it. This dream occurred in 1989. The dream starts with the 3 siblings visiting an old farmhouse they lived in as children 30 years ago with their other siblings and parents. The house was empty. Marie, David, and Gail all got out of the car and walked completely around the house, recalling climbing an old oak tree that held a tire swing, recalling the farm area and what used to stand there, etc. When the 3 returned to the front of the house, there on their steps sat their dear old dad. Dad passed away in April of 1974. Shocked to see their father on the steps, they called out to him. Dad stood at the 3 with a malevolent grin. He motioned for his kids to follow him into the house. They followed through the living room, past the kitchen, down the hall, until they reached their parents' old room. He turned and looked each one in the eye and put his fingers to his lips, as if to say shh. He then motioned with his hands for them to follow. He opened the bedroom door and they followed him inside. He walked to the closet and walked through the closet door. Now in each person's dream, they were the ones about to open the door. As each reached for the doorknob and slowly started turning the knob, their mother appeared from nowhere, screaming at them to not open that door. They instantly woke up from the dream. I was a teenager at the time this occurred, and I did not see the big deal about following their dad into the closet until we visited my grandmother. My grandmother was telling my mother of how David and Gail both called her after Marie did, saying they had the same exact dream as she had. My mother looked scared, and my grandmother told her they all needed to get into church because Satan himself was using their father's image to lure them into something evil. I asked dear old Granny how she got that from a dream and Grandpa going into a closet. She told me because her husband, their father, my granddad, was scared of closets. I thought she meant he was claustrophobic. She assured me he was terrified of closets. The whole time they were man and wife, she would have to get his clothing out of the closets and lay them out for him. She would have to put things into closets. He refused to open them or go into them. My grandmother believes that Satan used Granddad's image to lure the 3 siblings down a path of evil. I know this isn't much, but I love to hear the story. Within my years, I've had many ghostly experiences, but the most recent experience seemed to scare me the most. Almost every night sitting in the downstairs of my home, I feel a strong presence, each time at a different location within the dining room and the living room. First, you may want to know how my dining room and living room are set in my house. When you first walk into my home, you enter a little narrow hallway, where you then have to go through another door to get into my living room. Then, to get to my dining room, we have a huge opening, and there's my dining room and my steps to go to the second story in my home. The other night, I was sitting on my couch closest to the two living room windows, but something just kept telling me to look over at the window in the dining room. Sure enough, I saw a black mist that looked as if a face was watching me, but then it disappeared. I passed it off if it were nothing, and that I was seeing things, because it was around 11:30 p.m., and I was quite tired. For some odd reason, my shades were semi-open for 5 blades, and then the rest were closed, so no one can see. I then moved my brother to the other couch, and we sat together, and I just could not keep my eyes off the window in the hallway entrance. Within an hour, I was getting finally comfortable. My brother was sleeping. My mother and stepfather were sleeping, and my older brother was home upstairs, with his car parked outside. I gazed at the window, and the black mist was back, but this time, it was more clear and bigger. It seemed more like a body and a face, but turned to gaze out of my window. Then it sounded like someone was trying to open my front door. It's a big steel door, and when it's locked and somebody tries to open it, it sounds as if someone is pushing against it. It happened at least 6 times before it stopped. I held my little brother close to me. Within the next 15 minutes, it sounded like someone was walking in the hallway and jiggling keys. Well, that was enough for me. I woke my brother up and sent him into my room because I had my air conditioner on in my room. But the jingling sound seemed to follow us to right outside my bedroom door, then stop for the night. My mother recently saw the mist and told it to go back to wherever it came from. It then seemed to glide to my basement door and disappear. My home is about 150 years old, and back then, people couldn't afford to have a proper funeral, so they buried people in the walls in the basement or in the floor. We recently had a dirt basement floor and a cobblestone wall, but we had the floor cemented over. My grandfather, whom I can safely say is a ghost expert, senses something in the walls in my basement. Around my house, but mainly in my room, I know for a fact there is a ghost in my room, but she's a sweet woman, and she just seems to watch me until I fall asleep. There are several ghosts in my home, but recently, I feel as if more are residing here. Just the other night I was drifting to sleep in my room, and I heard the sound as if someone was breathing. I held my breath, and the sound was still there, so I turned the TV on. It seemed to just go away. I was scared, and looked towards the mirror, and saw a flash, and then nothing happened. But I saw the woman, and felt comfort. I feel as if she scared the other spirit away. In my grandmother's house, there is an attic, but it's hidden in the ceiling, and you have to pull the straps down. During the war at her home, soldiers were hid in the attic, and rumor has it, one night, the other people found them and killed everyone in the room. But the one young nurse was beaten and then murdered. I had a dream once about a place where there's a dangling light, and you have to walk on beams and then open a door, and there's a little room with bloodstains. I told my grandmother, and she said I described her attic exactly, even though I'd never been in the attic. The woman who was murdered was a beautiful woman, and she is often spotted around my grandmother's house, scrubbing floors and walking. My grandmother's house was remodeled after the war, and the woman comes down the steps and walks, straight turns, and goes out a door, which is now a window. But before there was a wall separating the rooms and a separate door. Recently, my grandma had seen a little boy petting her dogs, saying, "Come on, doggy, come with me." She thought it was my little brother because he had spent the night, but he was downstairs sleeping, and no one else in the house was awake. She knows he's a ghost, and she is comfortable with him. Although I am severely frightened of her basement, which in 1947, A man was found hanging with a grin on his face, and a woman shot in the head underneath him. There were people found suffocated in their beds, random strangers. My grandma says the boy was one of the children found, and the man is evil. She feels that he may harm me. She doesn't like anyone, except for her in her basement. I have many more stories to tell you, but I'm sorry, I'm out of time. I'll contact you later with many more stories. Thank you. Feel free to email me, or if you just want to exchange experiences, thank you.
Although this is a true tale, it's not one of your spine tinglers, just something odd that cannot be explained. It was told to me several years ago by a colleague and happened to her mum Jean and some friends. Although Jean lived in Romford, Essex, she regularly went to a Keep Fit class in a small school hall in Upminster. The class had finished and her friends had piled into her car and drove around the corner, parking near the chip shop, and they all ordered fish and chips. Like you do when you've just had a good workout. They were all sitting in the car quietly eating, when one person noticed something odd and nudged the person next to them. Eventually, they were all mesmerized, mouths agape, chips forgotten as their attention was focused on the activities in the churchyard over the road. Quite clearly, they could see a silent nighttime funeral procession of a coffin being carried on the shoulders by 6 pallbearers, all decked out in long black-tailed coats. They silently watched the procession walk from one side of the church and disappear around the other side. St. Mary's Lane, for anyone who lives nearby. Of course, they all asked the other, "Did you see what I saw?" Knowing full well they did. The next day, Jean decided to visit the church as she just had to know what happened. Maybe someone was buried late last night. However, she got to the church and found the vicar. She worded the question carefully so as not to look like a complete idiot, and was obviously stunned when the vicar told her that no funeral took place last night. She said that from the look on his face it was fairly obvious that he knew why she was asking. But being a vicar, he simply smiled and walked away. Spooky. I've been past the churchyard as my grandparents used to live just down the road, and it is quite a creepy-looking place. All the stones are really old and crumbly and covered in moss. None of the names or dates are readable. It's one of those graveyards where you can look at it for a little while, and then you kind of shudder and have to look away. I used to think it was my childish imagination, but even these days the place still gives me the creeps, even in the middle of summer. My story has to do with things that happened to me as a child. When I was 6 years old, my parents bought a very old house, probably around 100 years old, and that was back in 1976. It was a very large house, and some of the original wallpaper was still in it. I have always been kind of in tune with the supernatural, and I also have a psychic sense. I'm not saying I am psychic, but I just know things and I can't explain it. Well, anyway, I know that my sister was very afraid of this house. She is 3 years younger than me. She would either sleep with my parents or with me, and she would never cross the long hall that ran through the center of the house by herself. I know that one day I was sitting in the living room and I got this really weird feeling, like I wasn't the only one in the room. I felt like someone was staring at me. Now keep in mind that my mother and sister had gone to the store, so I was in the house alone. At this time, I was about 9 years old. I was sitting on the floor and I just happened to look up. If you are familiar with old houses, you know that some have these glass windows at the top of each door that I guess people used for ventilation before air conditioning was invented. Well, the upstairs of this house had been added years after the original one-story had been built, and the steps that led upstairs went even with the glass window above the door in the room I was in. There was also a small triangle of wood that was missing from the step, and that is where my eyes shifted to. There was something looking at me through that space. I was so scared that I grabbed my dog and ran to the front porch, just hoping my mother would drive up. I don't know what it was, but there was something there. People in the neighborhood were always asking if the house was haunted, and one time an old woman I had never seen before asked me if I knew of the girl that had been locked in her room, in my house, and she had died there. There is also another story that happened in this same house. My uncle was living with us. He was 70 years old, and I was about 10 at the time. One night I heard him calling my father. He was shouting, and that is what woke me up. My father went running into his room, and this was my uncle's reply. "I know you're not going to believe this, and I know I shouldn't be seeing this, but I do. There's a black woman standing in front of the fireplace holding a little girl's hand, and she's wearing a red coat and hat." Then my father said that my uncle's eyes followed something around the room, and then my uncle began to scream again, "No, go away! Don't come near me!" Then they disappeared. My father said that he had never been so scared in his life, because his uncle was being rational about it. Like he knew he shouldn't be seeing something like that, but he did. I knew there was something in that house. Although we moved out when I was 14, I still drive by it to look, and I still get a creepy feeling about it, just from driving by. I feel it in my bones. What do you think? I would really appreciate your opinion. Thank you so much.
In the summer of 1999, I bought a house in a small town in Washington state. I'm a California native, so as you can imagine, I had a difficult time adjusting to the calmer settings. It was almost too quiet for my liking. About 3 weeks after I moved into my new home, an old colonial-styled house, I decided and began looking for a roommate. Soon after I placed the ad, I got a phone call from a very willing young lady who said it sounded like the perfect location for her. I took her name down, and she said she would call me the next day to set up a time and place to meet. I waited all day for her phone call, but it never came. I figured she must have found some other place to stay, but I kept the spot vacant in case she called back. A few weeks later, she did call again, and as before, she told me she would call back the next day to set up a time and place to meet. I faithfully awaited her return call, but same as the first time, it never came. I began to get suspicious as to whether it was a prank caller or a real person of interest. I thought it was odd how she'd given me a name without a number. My attempts to find her in the phone book failed, so without any other place to turn, I gave up on the search. About 3 months later, I was up in the attic storing some Christmas decorations I wouldn't be needing for some time when my eyes fell upon an old stack of newspapers in the corner. I was somehow intrigued by a particular paper lying on the top of the stack. As I thumbed through it, I was quite shocked to read an article printed about a young woman who died in her house, the house I was currently living in, at the age of 22. Even more shocking was the name of the woman. It was an identical match to the woman who called about sharing my home. I couldn't catch my breath. I went down to the local historical library and discovered that this woman did indeed live in the very house I now owned in the late 1800s. My visit to the library occurred close to 6 months ago. Since then, late at night, I've heard crying downstairs in my living room. My aunt and uncle used to live in an old log cabin. We think it was by an Indian burial ground, but it was definitely haunted, and the spirit there was not good at all. One night, my aunt and uncle woke up to find they couldn't move. They were being held down by something, but that's not my story. My 3 cousins all shared the same room. It was the only room on the second level. I hated going up there by myself. I never had to before, but this time I did. I was about 6 or 7. My sisters and I had been playing board games with our cousins up in their room. When we went downstairs to watch movies, I left my shoes up there. When the time came to go, I couldn't find my shoes. I looked everywhere. Then my sister reminded me I left them in my cousin's bedroom. I went upstairs and planned to run into the room, get my shoes, then run out and down the stairs as fast as I could. I ran into the room and picked up the shoes, but as I was turning around, I felt something behind me. I was so afraid to turn around, but at the same time, I wanted to run down the stairs, right out of the house and into the car. So I slowly turned around. There I saw a small little Indian girl, maybe about my age. She was surrounded by a blue and white light. I just stood there until she vanished. I ran out to the car where my parents were waiting, and until now I have never told anyone my story except for my aunt, who also sees things. Later I found out that my aunt and uncle would pray to the Indians to watch over them, to protect them from whatever was in that house. Maybe the little Indian girl was just watching over my cousins. My wife and I had moved to the naval station at Mare Island of Vallejo, California. I was attached to the personal support office. About 4 months after reporting, I was sent to the Combat Systems Tech School's command to process new students. I hadn't heard about the school's past until my encounter. One day in the fall of 1993, I was typing up a report about 0730 before the other 3 civilians and 1 other sailor got there. The typewriter was next to the door to my office, so I didn't miss anyone coming or going. There also was just that one main entryway into the office cluster. No other exits except for a fire door with the alarm connected. Anyway, someone walked by my door and I thought it was my shipmate, so I asked how he was doing. I got no reply, so I thought he hadn't heard me and I decided to go bug him after I finished my report. I went to his office and found it locked. Then I noticed the light on down the hall. The light was moving ever so slowly and getting closer to me. It was then that I realized that it was actually a translucent figure of a sailor. It terrified me so much that I ended up passing out from a panic attack. One of the civilian computer programmers walked into the hallway at work, noticed I passed out and shook me awake. I told her I saw something in this hallway and she said that I probably was just overworking myself from stress. I also told her that I thought Brian had walked by. She looked at me and said that nobody had moved from their computers since she got there at about 15 minutes to 0700. She did tell me something fascinating though. She said that at times she could have sworn she heard a whistling and a crying sound coming from the hallway. It sounded a lot like a little girl. It was then that I learned that the school was a fleet hospital for the San Francisco Bay Area built back approximately 100 years ago. The night watch detail would find locked doors open and hear footsteps at night. There were stories told about people hearing sounds of a little ghost girl playing ball near the main staircase. I never had the chance to witness her, and the base is now closed, but it was very interesting. As for the sailor, I have absolutely no clue as to what the story behind this guy was. To spare myself the anxiety, I just revert to thinking it was only my imagination, although it felt as real as anything I could ever see. One other experience was shared by my wife, myself, and my mother-in-law at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii in 1995. My wife had been flown to Tripler Army Hospital due to complications with her first child. My mother-in-law arrived a day before I got there from my ship. Anyway, we were put up in the guest house at Hickam for a couple of nights before being moved temporarily to an officer's quarter in the corner of the base. It was a well-furnished room and had a pleasant air about it. That was until the night arrived. My wife was awoken that first night where she heard multiple whispers. She then went to get herself a cup of milk in the kitchen of the house when she saw the presence of 2 figures crouched down as if they were praying. They both wore brown robes like they were monks. This whole ordeal must have lasted 30 seconds and they faded away quickly. In the morning we both got up and discussed what we had felt that night. That's when she told me about what she witnessed. The crazy thing was, while she was experiencing that, I told her that I could have sworn I saw the face of an elderly man just staring back at me in the mirror when I used the bathroom. He had scars on his face and was balding. I'll never forget the sight of it. It was an extremely uncomfortable feeling.
This is a story that will always live with me for the rest of my life. My mother and father used to always take lengthy trips over the weekends to visit my grandparents in Ohio when we had lived in Michigan. We would drive about 4 hours, and we usually would get there by the evenings. My grandparents lived in a huge Victorian estate on top of a hill, surrounded by woods all around. The house had 6 bedrooms and was extremely spacious, so whenever we slept over, I got a room to myself on the 2nd floor. At the time, My dad suffered from terrible sleepwalking episodes, and they only seemed to trigger at this house. I can remember one night, I was sleeping in the room and had my window open. That was when I was awoken by soft sounds coming from outside of the window. It sounded like hymns and chanting, as if it was a lullaby. At first, I checked to see if the television from downstairs was accidentally left on, but it wasn't. I was starting to get really freaked out when I went back in my room, because I noticed my dad was walking towards the trail path into the woods. The house lights were shining bright enough so that I could see the woods well enough from the window. In a panic, I ran downstairs and outside as fast as I could and grabbed a flashlight, then chased after my dad into the woods. He had managed to walk so far into the path of the woods that we got to be a mile away, and the further I went into the woods, the darker it got. We just kept getting further and further away from the house, and it was really starting to get cold and scary. I started to call out for my dad, shining the flashlight straight ahead in the now pitch black woods, when I had lost him. For a split moment, I felt someone whisper my name in my ear, and the rustling sounds of leaves behind me, as if someone was walking right behind me. For some reason, I thought maybe my dad was behind me instead, so I turned and pointed my flashlight, and there was nothing there. I kept going, and continued to look for my dad. That was when I once again heard a voice, but this time in a low and guttural voice. I could have sworn I heard the voice say, "Let's play." At this point, I actually thought my dad was playing a practical joke, so then I yelled out to my dad and told him this isn't funny and to show himself. Even though the voice sounded nothing like him, I just kind of assumed, maybe to ease my mind in my panic state. Literally a split second later, I see a cloudy mist and what looked like an orb hovering from the distance of the woods and slowing going in my direction from afar. It then disappeared. I heard my dad's far off distant scream, and I started running faster into the woods to try to locate him. When I finally found him, he had fallen into this well that none of the family had any idea had existed. I quickly helped my dad out of the well, and he had asked me what happened. I brought him back into the house and told him that he was sleepwalking and managed to wander into the woods. The creepiest part of this whole experience was this. He said that while he was sleepwalking, he had dreamt that a woman in pioneer clothing urged him to find her missing son in the woods. She told him to run to the well and he will find him. When my dad told me this, I told him about hearing some soft singing before I rushed into the woods to get him, and that I heard voices and whispering into the woods. A couple days later, fascinated by the well that existed in the woods, we went to go see it in daylight. To my utter shock, we had made a gruesome discovery. We found what looked like human bones at the bottom of the well. We immediately called the police. They examined these bones, and we were able to confirm weeks later that they weren't animal remains, but human remains. We had the bones examined by a professional, and they believe that the bones belonged to a young boy who may have perished hundreds of years ago. My guess is in the early 1800s. I would like to state wholeheartedly that these events are in fact true, from my father's sleepwalking to the dream he had and the bones uncovered. It may sound a bit far-fetched, but I guess you'll have to take my word for it. This event happened in the 1970s, and I'm 70 years old now. This all happened when I was 17. I have a rather bizarre ghost story, or maybe it just appears that way to me, since I've never experienced ghosts before. It was many years ago, when I was 14 years old, and spending a few weeks at our lake home. One night my friend and I decided to spend the night in the den rather than our bedroom. The den has a lonely view of the lake and has a wall of windows. It is a very large room. As we were in our sleeping bags, I noticed what looked like a man sitting in the armchair. The apparition was black. You could not distinguish any features, but you could see a bowler hat or a similar hat on his head. He just sat there and didn't move, his arms resting on the chair. I was paralyzed with fear. I eventually mentioned this to my friend, or maybe she mentioned it to me first. I just remember that after a long time, we started talking about our late night visitor. We compared notes on what we were seeing, and it became apparent that we were both seeing the same thing. A shadow? I think not, and if you read on, you will know why I'm so sure. My friend and I became so scared that we buried ourselves in our sleeping bags and held on to each other for dear life. We knew we had to get out of there, but we were too scared to move. Eventually we got up our nerve and made a mad dash to the bathroom. Keep in mind, our lake house is quite large and the bathroom was not nearby. We huddled in the bathroom for some time and got up our nerve to make it to our bedroom. This time, for some reason, we didn't run. As we were making our way to the bedroom, we saw another apparition on the living room sofa. This was definitely no shadow. There were no windows in this room, therefore no light except the bathroom light. This apparition was easier to see. It was a woman from the turn of the century. She was dressed in a white dress, possibly a Victorian wedding gown, and lying in the pose of a deceased person. As you could imagine, we hightailed it to our bedroom. When in the bedroom, we sat up with the light on. I'm not sure how much time passed, but eventually, we heard what appeared to be a marching band playing. We looked at the clock and saw that it was after 3 a.m., and therefore highly unlikely that a marching band would be performing in this rather sleepy-like community. Had it not been for this, we would have considered it as teenage imaginations going wild. You can see things, but hearing them is an entirely different story. In the morning, we checked out the house to see if there was any way music could be played by itself in the house. We found an old radio down in the basement, but it wasn't plugged in. We then plugged in the radio, and it did not even work. We asked my grandparents if they had heard anything, and they said they hadn't. When we told them our stories, they just laughed, and almost everybody else we had told this to laughs also. If they don't laugh, they listen and nod their heads, but we can tell they are just being considerate and patronizing us. We are now both 30 years old, born a day apart, and live over 1,000 miles apart. When we are together, we still talk about this and stand by our story and memory. We still agree about what we saw and heard. I have no explanation about this, but I will not sleep alone in this house. I don't even visit often, but when I do, I'm still scared to death. Seabrook, Toddville Road, the former Toddville Mansion, which has recently been torn down. The property turned into apartments or condos. Reports of a strange creature roaming the grounds, noises, feelings of being watched, shadowy figures. Actually, this mansion was the List Mansion. The story of this place was well known to the people of Seabrook, who lived there at the time. I lived near the List Mansion for many years. Several acres of land were bought by a Houston business owner in the late 70s to early 80s, right on Galveston Bay, near the intersection of Toddsville Road and East Meyer Road. Bill List was his name, and for the most part at first, no one knew who he was. only that there was a major construction project going up near the bay. Bill List owned a trailer manufacturing business, and with the success of his business came great wealth. The mansion was a massive undertaking. Built up on several feet of soil, the 3-story brick structure dwarfed the modest home surrounding the property. The brick foundry, where Bill was buying the bricks for his mansion, was unable to keep up production of bricks for the mansion and bricks for other products, so Bill just bought the brick foundry so all the bricks made could go into his construction for project. Month by month, the mansion began to take shape. The stark brick structure was 3 stories tall, 4 if you count the massive garage on the ground level. All the windows on every floor featured wrought iron bars. It was divided into 2 separate sections, with a large glassed-in garden and pool. Catwalks on the second floor crossed from the front of the house to the back part. The rooms were arranged into 2 separate apartments, with kitchens, bathrooms, and living areas. The entire property was surrounded by a brick wall from Toddville Road. The List Mansion, as it was called, resembled a prison, which was not far from true. When construction was completed, me and some friends were in the Kroger parking lot in Seabrook when 2 guys a little older than us invited us to a big party to celebrate the opening of the List Mansion. We talked to them for a few minutes, and then they left. We did not go to the party. For years after that, you rarely saw anyone coming or going from the mansion, even though several families could live there at the same time and never see each other. The guys we saw at Kroger that day never showed up anywhere in town. Then one day, Bill List was dead, murdered, and the whole story came out in the Daily Citizen, the Bay Area newspaper. The List Mansion was built like a prison, not to keep people out, but to keep people in. As it turns out, Bill List had a preference for younger men and would cruise the alleyways in parts of Houston where runaways would frequent. He would offer them a place to stay and drugs in return for his indulgence for the young men. Bill would keep them drugged and locked in the mansion, providing everything for them but freedom. Some would stay, and others would eventually be let go, but it was the final group of guys who figured it all out. They decided that Bill List must die, so one day, they got a hold of a shotgun and waited for Bill to come home from work. Bill never made it up the stairs from the garage before he was shot and killed. The guys who killed him ransacked the mansion, stole Bill's credit cards, and left. Some were picked up on their way to Canada. Others were caught in the Houston area. For years after the death of Bill List, the mansion was up for sale, and yet no one would buy it. Caretakers were brought in to maintain the property, and eventually, a bunch of people at a rock and roll band rented it for a while. I moved from Seabrook in the early 90s. Eventually, the List Mansion was bought by a real estate land developer, and he tore down the List Mansion. In its place was built Suco condos with clay tile roofs. There is nothing left of the List Mansion, except the sordid stories of the long residents of Seabrook. These are my memories of the List Mansion. I grew up in a small town, and for about a year, we lived in a haunted house when I was just 2 years old. In other words, I don't remember specific things, just feelings. It all started when my mother and father moved from South Carolina to Kentucky. They rented an old house with a huge basement. This was told to me by my mother. I don't remember much about the house, so this is all secondhand information. They had lived there only about a month when my mother and older sister started to notice things. They told me that I was the focus of the spirit, as it would do things to me or around me. Here's a few of the things that happened to me when I was little. One time, my mother and sister was sitting in the living room watching TV. I had a little wooden rocking chair that I loved to sit in. My father was at work working a night shift in the coal mines. Mom said, all of a sudden, things got very cold and my little rocking chair started rocking very fast and the rocking tossed me out onto the floor. Then, the chair fell backwards against the wall with no one in it by the way, and my mother and sister both heard a very dull laughing. My mother said that the thing in the house would push me, and a few times when she was watching me play on the front porch, would pick me up and drop me down hard on the ground. My mother says that she was terrified to leave me alone. Then another time, my big sister and her best friend were playing with me in the front yard, and my mother said she heard them screaming for her. When she went out in the yard, my sister and her friend was holding on to me and crying. I was trying to go down the little hill into a little field below our house, begging to go play with it. My sister to this day swears that she and her friend saw a big black figure hiding behind a tree and motioning for me to come to it. And what was scary was that I was going. My sister's friend refused to come visit her at her house after that episode. My mother told me that I told her its name. I won't repeat it here, for it makes me have anxiety attacks, and that I lived in a deep dark hole in the ground, down in the field below our house. My mother went looking for a hole in the ground, and she found an old well that had been boarded up, and the weeds grown over it pretty bad, so it was very difficult to see. She didn't tell me if she experienced anything there or not, but she wouldn't talk about it with me. She kept begging my father to move. My mother said it would laugh at her, and she was constantly scared. Finally, one night when my dad was home, something happened that made my dad rethink and take my mother seriously. My parents were in bed, and it was pretty late. My father looked up and noticed the shadow of someone staring at him in the darkness. My dad at first thought it was my sister, so he raised up and asked her what was wrong. The thing laughed, and my mother screamed that it wasn't my sister because the shadow was too big to be my sister. When she screamed, my dad jumped up to turn on the lights, and it laughed again and disappeared. From then on, my dad took what my mother said seriously. After a while, my dad was able to buy a piece of land, and we moved, and according to my mother, not a minute too soon. To this day, my mother refuses to talk about it. I didn't find out about this until years later, when I was watching TV about 15 years old or so. I saw a commercial for cat food, with the same name of the thing that had haunted us for years before. I had no idea about this because my mother didn't tell me about it until afterwards. As soon as I heard the commercial and some of the cat food, I had an anxiety attack. When I told my mother what happened, she turned very pale and told me some of the story. Some history of the house after we moved out. There was a man and his daughter who moved into the house. He was a single father, so he had his mother move into the house with him to help him take care of his daughter while he worked. Within 2 years of them living there, the man went crazy and one night killed himself with a gun. The daughter and her grandmother moved out at the night of his suicide and moved away to another state. No one ever lived in the house again. It stood empty for years, and the house started falling apart. The owner had since died a long time ago, and everyone just sort of ignored the old house. My mother never told anyone of our experiences. Finally, about 6 or 7 years ago, they tore down the house in the basement and they built a community fire department on the property. That building isn't exactly where the house was. It stands about 30 or so feet from where the original house stood. Anyway, that is my story. I've had other experiences as an adult, but I will save those for another day. Thanks for listening. I live in a 2-story townhome. It was the middle of July, and it was very hot in Kansas City. I was sleeping on the couch downstairs, as the upstairs is hot in the summer months. I was sleeping, and I remember a low, heavy, dark voice saying I must help Laura, my cousin, understand. I woke up startled by the deepness of the voice. You could even say a little bit scared. My dog, which hardly ever barks, was looking into the kitchen and growling, and then slowly he started to bark. He was watching something, and when I looked in the direction he was looking, of course I couldn't see anything. The light from the outside street lamp was beaming through the window, so it was somewhat light. He started to back away and follow the presence into the den, and then to the wall that was straight across from me. He was watching something, but of course, I still couldn't see anything. But from the way I woke up, in a startled state, I was somewhat scared to move. Like an idiot, I just stayed still and watched my dog follow this presence that only he could sense. He then started to go to the door, located on the wall across from me, and which opens to my garage, growling at the door. He would back up and then move closer, and then he started to smell under the door. Still, I was too afraid to move. I just stayed there and watched. Within 5 to 10 minutes of this, the presence seemed to have left. My dog stopped growling and was going from the kitchen to the wall, into the door again and again, as if to look for something. Finally, he gave up and just curled up at my feet, which have not moved an inch this whole time, and fell asleep. Feeling now that the presence had left the room, I went to the door, which led to my garage, and pushed on it to make sure the door was closed. Once again stating what an idiot I am, I did not dare to open the door. However, I didn't really have a choice, because that was when the door cracked open just enough that I could see the face and a body of a bloodied lady in a black robe. It appeared for 40 seconds, and I saw her long enough to make out that she had to be a nun. I just remember her face looking so badly bruised and beaten, as if she was hit with a bat or something damaging enough to give her a black eye. I turned away in fright, then opened the door completely to see that nobody was there anymore. It was like it appeared in a flash of lightning, then was gone. Just to give you some background on my house, the door that goes to my garage does not have a lock in it. Yes, this is dangerous, for if my garage door is open, anybody could just walk in, right into my house. Maybe this nun I saw was really a homeless person. Maybe it was someone who was trying to rob the house, but since they saw me, they fled. Nothing was stolen. Everything was in one piece. Feeling somewhat safe that the presence had left, I joined my dog and soon fell asleep. In the morning I awoke, went upstairs to take a shower, and dressed for work. When I came downstairs, I gathered up all my things and opened the door which leads to my garage, and stood there in total amazement. My garage door was wide open. I left the door open all night and morning. I truly feel my spirit guide was trying to warn me, and I was too stupid and too afraid to listen to him. As I drove to work, I thanked him for trying to warn me, and I promised to try and listen more carefully next time. The reality sank in that I could have been robbed or beaten. Yes, today I'm buying a chain lock for that door and installing it right away. In hindsight, I wish I would have been more accepting of the events that were happening to me. If this has taught me anything, it's to stop, slow down, and listen to the ones who are trying to help me. As a youngster, I was playing with my toys in the lounge and suddenly, I had this great feeling of fright around me. So I went running into my mother, who was washing the dishes. She told me not to be frightened, as there was nothing to be frightened of. So she assured me and took me back into the lounge to carry on playing. But as she walked back to carry on washing, she saw a figure standing still in the hallway. It looked as though it appeared to be a monk in a brown habit, with his face covered by his hood. All you could see was his feet, which had sandals on. My mother walked towards it, and it disappeared into my mother's bedroom. But my mother always said how I must have sensed the presence of this ghost. Another time in the same house, it was nighttime, and I couldn't sleep, so I was just looking into space when 3 squares appeared on the wall. I thought that it must have been some kind of light shining in from the window, knowing full well that no light normally shines through, as we had blinds and curtains up at the window. I kept on staring at the squares on the wall. They didn't move or anything, but I felt really frightened like in the other story. I must have fell asleep, thinking about the lights on the wall. In the morning, when I awoke, the first thing I did was get out of my bed and go straight to the wall, hoping in the back of my mind that there wouldn't be any kind of marks on the wall where the square was. But I was wrong. Where the squares were, there were deep-lined marks, like holes that were pressed into the wall around where the shapes were. They looked almost like claw marks and definitely weren't there before. There is no logical explanation for this story, not that I can explain anyway. It was not possible for any light to come through the curtains, and there were no other kind of lights or anything on in the room or in the house. I've tried to come up with some sort of explanation, and I don't have one, and that happened about 23 years ago. I've had some strange and incredible experiences over the years. Just posted one in the last batch. Some of them I haven't sorted out how to share yet, but the following experiences are pretty strange. My roommate and I were living in a Seattle neighborhood called Capitol Hill. Our apartment building, the Ben Lamont, was built in 1910, and my apartment overlooked a little park area with a long retaining wall in the back. One night, I must have fallen into a deep sleep as soon as I went to bed. When I woke up the next day, I immediately told my roommate about a disturbing dream, that a menacing, sinister black figure had climbed out of a hole in the ground, right against the retaining wall. He seemed full of rage and anger, and was coming closer and closer to our window, and meant real harm. It was a very real, fearful thing. After hearing my dream, my roommate said she tried to wake me up soon after I went to sleep, but I was out cold. She said she heard something like a gunshot outside in the park and walked through a darkened apartment to the living room's bay window to see if she could see anything. She said she saw a man who was built like a tank, but fitting the physical description of the man in my room to a T. He appeared to be staring up at her. For whatever reason, I don't understand why she did this, considering she thought she heard a gunshot, but she shined a flashlight on him. When she did, she could no longer see him. Although she saw everything else, the trees, the ground, bushes, everything where she was standing was illuminated, but he had vanished. When she covered the light, there he was again. I guess she did this a few times until he really vanished. Very, very strange. Another time I was staying in an artist's loft in San Francisco that was in a really creepy area on Market Street and 6th. I was in bed, just starting to get that semi-lucid feeling when I woke with a frightened gasp. The only way to describe it is a flash vision. I thought for sure my throat had been slashed with a deep long knife from left to right, and all this blood was pouring. I remember sitting up gasping, knowing it was fatal. Then on the news the next day, chills went up my spine when the anchor person said that someone's throat had been slashed at a hotel on 6th Street, right around the corner from where I was staying. Somehow, I must have picked up on the victim's fear, anxiety, and shock. Not really a ghost story, but still weird. Another time, a friend and I had an interconnecting dream. I dreamt one part, and she dreamt the other. They matched perfectly, and since we both dreamt this right before we were waking up, we assumed we had these dreams at the same time. I think I was about 7 when I first started seeing things in my house and around my neighborhood. The first time I saw something was when my sister and I were sharing a room. I knew that I always felt something in the room, but I never saw anything, so I really paid no mind. Then one day, while I was sitting in my room, I looked up and saw an image by my door. I don't know exactly what it was, but I know that I was scared. Over the next couple of days, I would hear things in my room, like people walking, the doorknob would jiggle, and things would just tip over. When I talked to my mom about these things, she told me not to be scared of them, just tell them to go away. The next night, I was sitting on my bed, and I heard somebody walking around. I did what my mom told me, and told it to go away. It didn't work. The sound became closer, and an image began to appear. At first I was kind of scared, but when I saw what the image was, I wasn't so scared anymore. It was a little girl, about 5 years old, who was lost. She was just staring at me for a while, and then she just sat down on the bed next to me. She was sitting next to me for about 2 minutes, and then she was just gone. For a few years, I wouldn't see anything, just hear things. When my older sister moved out, my sister and I finally had our own rooms. I stayed in our original room, and my sister moved to my other sister's old room. For a couple of months, things were cool, and then my sister woke up in the middle of the night and asked if she could sleep with me. The next morning, when I asked her why she slept with me, she told me it was because she was hearing people talking from the closet. Me and her had to switch rooms because she wouldn't sleep in her room. The first night, nothing happened, but the second night was completely different. I was hearing whispering and footsteps. At first, I thought I was scaring myself, but when I heard someone ask why my sister and I switched rooms, I knew I wasn't imagining it. At first, everyone thought I was making it up, but when I told my grandma about it, she looked at me as if she were surprised. She told me that I wasn't the only one in the family to be able to hear and see things. It was something that actually ran in my family. After that, things started happening more. People would talk to me. I would feel them touch my arm, face, or even feet when I was sleeping. And sometimes, I could feel someone sitting at the end of my bed. I think when I really got scared was when I decided to sleep with my light on so nothing would bother me. But when someone said turn the light off, that was it. I ran to my mom's room and fell asleep on the edge of her bed. That was the last time anything happened to me for about a year. I thought it was just something I went through, but when I turned 14, it got bad. Not only was I seeing things at home, but I was seeing them outside occasionally. I learned not to say anything, because when I would, people would just laugh at me. My family and I became aware of a particular area of a supposed haunting in the Jamestown, North Carolina area. We were intrigued by the article and wanted to investigate, even though we are people of faith. The article, which made us aware of the haunting, was in a local magazine and caught my two sons' attention after my wife read the article in a restaurant. The article described the following. In the 1920s, there was an accident in Jamestown near a certain bridge underpass involving two high school students returning from the local prom. From time to time, locals have reported driving by the area where the accident occurred and spotting a young woman dressed nicely standing by the roadside, needing a lift. The stories tell of a young woman named Linda entering the car and describing where she needed to be dropped. Upon nearing the destination, she vanishes. Of course, my wife and I are skeptical, to say the least, so, unaware of any peril, or should I say for a lack of knowledge or fear, we thought we would investigate with our two young sons, of 5 and 8 years. We arrived at the location, which is off the main road into the woods, about 100 yards. There is an old stone-blocked railroad underpass, located next to the now regularly used underpass. Both of the underpasses have been covered with graffiti in tribute to the stories of Lydia. The old underpass, however, has been overgrown with ivy and weeds and is relatively secluded to say the least. Nevertheless, we were determined to investigate despite the spooky nature of the claims. As we entered the underpass, the air became distinctly colder, which we all noticed. We all felt frightened and left after only a few moments. We got in our car and drove home. We thought nothing of the event until that evening. Strange things began to occur at about 2 a.m. Of all things, an old woody doll with a pull string began to speak in a toy box and would not stop. The electric van door opened and closed several times without any provocation. My boys thought someone was in their room. We thought we were frightened from our prior experiences and let our logical minds control. The house still seemed strange to me, and I had difficulty sleeping, even though my male ego would not let me admit my fear. Time went by, and although the supposed haunting events were less traumatic, they nevertheless continued for about a month. It came time for the van to have a regular tune-up, and we took it to the dealership. When my wife returned with the van, the trouble ceased. I don't know what we experienced exactly over that period in 2001, but it seemed real. My wife and I still question the validity of our haunting, but our youngest son still maintains that Megan, as he refers to her, often talked to him and was very nice. Anyway, it's a nice little story we often tell family members who don't think we're lost on cozy evenings. Hope you will enjoy. I used to work at this daycare center that only stayed in business for 2 years. The building that we worked in had many owners and many businesses, but never stayed in business for longer than 2 years. Usually, bankruptcy would follow. Anyway, I had worked there for about a year and had always been scared of the back of the building. There was a long dark corridor that always gave me the chills, and I always felt like I was being watched. I had the early morning shift, so I had to be there at 6:30 and get ready for the kids to arrive. One morning, I had an infant who was only 4 months old and was asleep at the time of the incident. We were in our room, and I was writing out papers for the rest of the day when I saw a toy out of the corner of my eye being thrown across the room. I didn't think anything of it, and played it off as my imagination until a week later when another coworker told me what happened to her. She was in the sleep room changing a child's diaper when she looked right and saw a little girl standing there staring at her. She looked back at the child she was changing and back, and the little girl had vanished. There were no children besides the one she was changing in the room with her. It freaked her out, and when she told me, freaked me out, because then I realized that the toy that I saw thrown across the room wasn't my imagination. Neither one of us had another experience, but those two were enough for us.
Did you get through this whole video? Over an hour and a half of a compilation of the best stories compiled from the past month. If you did, pat yourself on the back, give this video a like, share it, and in the comment section below, let me know you enjoyed it. Or if you didn't enjoy it, let me know in the comment section below. Just comment anything, because my name is Phantomofdarkness. Anyway, guys, I hope you really did enjoy the video. I put together, obviously the stock footage, so a host of new stock footage at your disposal for you guys to enjoy throughout the first hour or so of this compilation. I did have a great selection of stories this time out, this month, and I think next month for March, it'll be a lot better. So, guys, remember, if you like food, eat it all, and if you like yourself, then eat yourself too. I don't know what that means, but I gotta go, guys. So, love ya, and remember to comment, like, share, and subscribe, because in this world, that's all it matters. That's what matters.